Hello and welcome to a Rusty Crash Course episode. This episode will focus on Chile. So, I've been planning to make a political video for a long while, and it seems like there's enough interest in something on Chile based on my conversation with people, so I thought why not finally do it this long weekend I have. And yeah, I end up spending a greater part of my long weekend on this, so I hope there's something that both you and I will find to be a time well spent. So, you might have come to be aware of some colorful figures that have emerged over the past few years in Chile, and this include a Palestinian communist mayor, a Naruto run lady. This lady did the Naruto run in the Chilean Congress. Someone called Tia Pikachu, which means anti-Pikachu. And then there's this good boy, which is named Black Cop Killer. You might have read about this good boy on Twitter in a very nice thread. So yeah, there's these interesting figures that emerged recently. And if you're somewhat familiar with Latin American politics, or just politics in general, you might have also heard of some more less colorful, let's just say, figures like Salvador Allende, Augusto Pinochet, and the Chicago Boys, who are not a band, but they got this bandy name. So yeah, there's all these interesting figures in Chilean politics, and to understand this, we might need to dig a little bit deeper into the past. Before that though, let's go back and look at this picture I use in the cover, I guess, of this video. This person is holding a sign saying that neoliberalism was born in Chile and will die in Chile. What does that mean? Why does this sign says neoliberalism was born in Chile? Like, it's a commonly used phrase, and I'm sure it was used, like you heard of use here and there, and it might not be very clear what the heck it means. And yeah, this is a good opportunity to explore the origin of neoliberalism as well, in addition to understand the politics of Chile and getting to know all these figures that I mentioned. But as I said, to get to the bottom of this, we need to dig further back. We need to go back to the 70s. Yes, we need to go back to the 70s. Please take a moment to appreciate this. I spend more time than I would like to admit on this, so please clap. Okay, now that you have sufficiently appreciated this, let's start and go to the timeline that I made. Yeah, look at this fancy timeline. So let's start off in 1970. Yes, precisely in 1970. This was the year Salvador Allende was elected to the presidency. So here we are, Salvador Allende, 28th president of Chile. He ran as part of the Unidad Popular, or Popular Unity Coalition. This was a coalition of left-wing parties in Chile, and he was a member and a co-founder of the Socialist Party of Chile. He was a Marxist, a democratic socialist, I say, a real democratic socialist. Obviously, I'm making a reference to Bernie Sanders, who also called himself a democratic socialist. I don't think that's quite accurate. I think he should be referred to as a social democrat. The difference here might not be too obvious to many of you. That's something I need to explain in the future topic, I guess. But just know that Allende was serious about achieving socialism. Allende was a physician, just like Che Guevara. They both saw the injustice in Latin America and decided to pursue politics. For Allende, he pursued the electoral route, and he ran for the presidency many times. He ran 4 times, in 1952, 1958, 1964, and finally in 1970 when he was finally elected. Okay, now that Allende was finally elected the president, what's his program? What's his political program? What is he going to do for his supporter and the people? And the answer is a lot. In fact, it's hard to cover everything. So I picked some stuff that I thought was notable, but it's far from exhausted. So let's start with healthcare. Allende made massive investment into healthcare, which is something you can expect for a left-leaning politician, a left-leaning president. But it's not only that. Allende built hospital, maternity clinic, but also neighborhood health center. And from these neighborhood health center, Allende established what he called hospital councils and local health councils. In these councils, citizens, local citizens, bureaucrats, doctors, they can come together and they can decide on how to implement healthcare in their neighborhood. So it's not just something top down, not something that goes from the central government, the local community government, all the way down. It's something that's more horizontal. So that's part of how Allende tries to put power into the local people, into the workers. Allende also extended maternity leave from 6 weeks to 12, and extended the free meal program they had from age 6 to age 15. That means if you're age 15 back then in Chile, you can still access a free meal program, which is quite nice. Allende made massive investment into education. He increased enrollment into primary education, so elementary school, secondary school, enrollment in those increased. But not only that, he abolished tuition fees for post-secondary education for universities, and that led to That led to an increase in enrollment in university of some, I think 78%, so 89% actually. It's quite a significant increase, huge in fact, in his short term, which is 3 years. Allende massively combated food insecurity. He had free school meal program, universal free school meal program. So if you're per pill, you get food. Fair enough. He also have free food program for the poor. So if you're poor, you get your access to food program. He decreased malnutrition in Chile by 17% in his 3 years in office. And they also made massive investment into the arts and culture. And by investment in art and culture, I don't mean he just built some fancy street art in downtown Santiago metro station, or there's this fancy paints on the wall. He was interested in something that's accessible, something that is for the mass. So for example, he nationalized a private publishing house, and in his 3 years in office, 12 million copies of books, magazine, documents, and were published. Among this 12 million, 8 million were actually books. And among these books, they're cheap. He have these cheap editions of these great literary work that were produced on a weekly basis. And in most cases, these were sold out within the day they were released. So this massive investment into art and culture was something that he tried to make sure the mass have access to, but it was also very, very popular. It was very successful. Allende invested in public work program. He was interested in decreasing unemployment, and he was interested in making sure those work go into public good. So for example, he rescheduled the Santiago subway project to make sure the subway would serve working class neighborhood first. And of course, this was also incorporated under a public work program. Allende also pursued a massive housing program. So this means, for example, Allende built 52,000 housing units annually in his 3 years in office. And that was huge because Chile wasn't a big country. I mean, it still isn't a particularly large country right now, but this was a huge number, particularly back then. Allende normalized relationship with Cuba. This was interesting because, since the Cuban Revolution, the United States of America hasn't been a fan. And through an organization called the Organization of American States, a pretty creative name, OAS, the US been able to pressure Latin American countries to not have a relationship with Cuba. By the time Allende came to office, 2 countries have already decided not to follow the US lead. Those 2 were Mexico and Canada, interesting enough. Chile was the 3rd country. He established formal, friendly diplomatic relationship with Cuba. And in fact, Castro came over for a 1-week visit, and he liked Chile so much he stayed for another week, and then another, and before we know it, Castro stayed for like a whole month before he returned back to Cuba. So that kind of shows you how much he enjoyed the hospitality of Chile. Now on some harder hitting stuff, not that the previous stuff weren't hard hitting, but wage is always important. Allende implemented a program where everybody, including parents, need to be paid a minimum wage. So sometimes some minimum wage they have exception for like tip worker or apprentice, etc. He made sure there's an obligatory minimum wage for everyone. He also massively increased it. If you're a blue-collar worker, by the end of Allende's administration, your minimum wage increased by as much as 41%. If you're a white-collar worker who have a higher wage than blue-collar worker to begin with, your wage increased by as much as 10%. So he increased the minimum wage for everyone, but he also decreased the disparity of the wage between white-collar and blue-collar worker. He pursued a mass land redistribution program because, in many developing countries, often there's mass ownership of land in a few families, by a few landowners. It was kind of feudal and not very equitable. And they implemented a policy where no landowner can own more than roughly 200 acres of land. And if you own beyond that, it will be redistributed. The result of this policy was that 40% of Chile's agricultural land ended up being expropriated and redistributed by the end of his administration. So really ambitious. Lastly, this is something that's very, very vital. Allende nationalized copper. Copper is very important for Chile. Now, Chile is a developing country, so Chile is not particularly rich, but one resource they have plenty of is copper. And copper accounts for 51% of Chile's foreign exchange earning. Now, you might be wondering what foreign exchange earning means. So, with a developing country like Chile, it's not able to produce everything they need. They need to import stuff. And these things can be as simple as food, but they can be as complex as advanced machinery. They need to, make stuff. And, to buy these stuff, to import this stuff, you need foreign currency. For example, you want to buy some advanced machinery from the United States, you will need to have American dollars. And to earn those American dollars, Chile rely on copper. That is 51% of the way they earn this vital foreign currency in which they use to import stuff. It also accounts for 16 to 80% of the national budget of Chile, so copper was extremely important. And unfortunately for Chilean, copper was not owned by Chilean. Copper was owned by multinational corporations. Many of them there was in fact, but the most important of which is the ITT, which is an American corporation. They extracted huge profit over 6 decades, I believe, was up to billions, and that's like a lot of money back then. And it's naturally frustrating for a Chilean to see that the natural resource they earn, the profit is not really going into them, it's going to foreign multinational corporations. So the nationalization of copper have always been a hot topic. In fact, the pressure for nationalization is so strong that even Allende's more conservative predecessor pursued a nationalization program in regards to copper. The problem with what his predecessor did was that he did it in an incremental way. So he get like 50% of the share in these companies first, in these mines first, and then he can't pursue more nationalization of the other 50% until he paid off that 50% he just purchased. It's a very slow process, and it wasn't deemed a process that was quick enough and fair by the Chilean public. So Allende vowed to make this right. He proposed a formula, his administration proposed a formula, in which the profit of the corporation, the profit the corporation earned in all the previous year, in excess of the profit they were earned normally from copper elsewhere. So these are extra profit. The copper from Chile was extra profitable compared to the copper from, say, Iran or somewhere. He calculated the difference in the profit, and he deducted that profit from the compensation he was paying to nationalize the copper mine. And you can imagine that didn't please corporation like ITT. And if you know terms like Banana Republic, you might know that sometimes these big corporations like to take actions of their own, like to take action into their own hand. And the ITT did exactly that. To do that, they talked to the CIA. The ITT it's interesting because they find it very easy to talk to the CIA, and the reason for that is because they literally have a flipping director, former director of the CIA, among their board of director. So you know what, they make it easy, and they talk with the CIA some 40 times. During this time, they funnel money into the opponent of Allende through the CIA, and they basically just try to bankroll his opposition and bankroll propaganda against Allende to scare voters away from Allende. And it didn't work in 1970. Allende was elected. So the thing about the CIA though is that it didn't require a lot of convincing from corporations like ITT to persuade them that they need to overthrow Allende. No, not at all in fact. So here we have two Gauls, and they were very much interested in development in Chile back then. So here we have Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon in particular was absolutely incensed that Allende got elected. It had been a long-standing policy of the United States to make sure Allende don't get elected. In fact, in the period between 1962, I believe, and 1964, the CIA spent $2.6 million to finance the campaign of Allende's opponents, while they spent $3 million in just pure anti-Allende propaganda to make sure Allende don't get elected. That's between 1962 and 1964, and that's like more than $5 million. Like, think about it, this is 1970, man. These millions are worth so much more than they are now, and they were spending that much money to make sure Allende don't get elected. And yeah, that was before the 1970 election. The 1970 election, they obviously still try to do that, but this time they failed, and Nixon was incensed. In response, Nixon won the CIA and just the whole American apparatus to make the economy scream. The economy being the Chilean economy. They were gonna wreak havoc in the Chilean economy to make sure Allende can stick around. Now, Henry Kissinger here kind of elaborate on the reasoning. We cannot let him succeed, Kissinger said, because he has legitimacy. He is democratically elected, and suppose other governments decide to follow in his footsteps, like a government in Italy. What are we going to do then? What are we going to say when other countries start to democratically elect their own Salvador Allende's? So yeah, they were very much intent on making sure Allende first don't get sworn in. Actually, they don't want him to get sworn in, and if he gets sworn in, which he did, then they were very much hell-bent on making sure he don't stay around. To do that, the CIA envisioned a plan. Their plan A was to kidnap someone. Not Allende. I guess that could have been a plan. But no, they were going to kidnap a dude called Rene Snyder. Now, a little bit more background into the 1970 elections. In the 1970 presidential election, Allende won 36% of the vote. So, not a majority, he won a plurality. He ran over the second place opponent, which got 34%, I believe. And in Chile, if you don't get a majority back then in the presidential election, what happened is that the top two candidates goes to Congress, and Congress vote on who get elected to be president. And the custom is that the Congress will simply vote for the guy with the most votes, which, you know, makes sense. They have done this at least 3 times, I believe, before this current election. So the expectation, of course, based on custom, is that Congress will vote in Allende. Now, Allende, of course, has a lot of powerful opponent, including the CIA, and not only CIA, but we'll get more into it later. But the point is, there was pressure to not swear in Allende, and Allende's party, Allende's coalition, Popular Unity, and his leftist allies do not have a majority in Congress. A very big part of Congress was controlled by a party called the Christian Democrat. The Christian Democrat were kind of like a centrist, center-left, center-rightish party, and they weren't a big fan of Allende, and they were trying to decide whether they should shorten Allende. Besides them, there was also the military. Many officers in the military were not a big fan of Allende, and they were kind of not into the idea of him becoming president. One guy, though, was absolutely not interested in stopping Allende from becoming president, and that guy is Rene Snyder. Snyder was the commander-in-chief of the Chilean army, so he's a top dog, and he was what they call a constitutionalist. And what that means is that Snyder did not believe that the army should be politically involved. He believed the army's duty is strictly professional and to make sure they protect the constitution, protect the integrity of the political process in Chile. And, that made him an impediment to the plan of certain officers in the army and the CIA and, various other actors. So they need to get rid of him. So they plan to kidnap him. And they did that. And it didn't go well. Snyder tried to defend himself from the kidnapping attempt. He pulled out his handgun and, there was shooting and stuff. And during the process, Snyder got mortally wounded. He died in hospital later after that attempt, and his death provoked a national outrage. Of course, right? This outrage caused the army and the Chilean Congress to rally behind Allende. So Allende was sworn in with the support of Congress. So Plan A failed, but there's always Plan B, and also it's important to note it's not only the army that has an interest in getting rid of Allende. Allende have many opponents in different sectors of Chile. Chile is not a homogeneous country. There's many different people with different interests. So, for example, there's the landowner. Of course, he was redistributing land. That's obviously going to take up some landowners. There was the good old capitalists, capitalists, bourgeoisie, socialists, etc. There was a court, because, Allende was pursuing policy, and in some of the policy, the court wrote deemed illegal, deemed unconstitutional, etc. The court is also an opponent that stand in the way of the policies Allende tried to implement. There was Congress, as I mentioned, which have two main opposition parties to Allende, the Christian Democrat here, and what we call the National Party here. The National Party represent the far right. It's not only these interests, though, not only these different sectors. There's also one thing that might surprise people, and that's the trucker. And by trucker, I don't just mean trucker. By trucker, I mean the middle class. Now, in election in Chile, roughly 30, 45, 40% of the people go to the left. So 40% of the electorate will vote for popular unity, and that include the Socialist Party, that include the Communist Party, etc. Roughly 35 to 40% vote for the left. And then another roughly 35 to 40% vote for the Christian Democrat. These are mostly, middle class people who are more well off than working class people. And then there's the top echelon of society who tend to vote for the right-wing National Party. And the Christian Democrat is a party that can sometimes, usually in charge, but in this particular instance, they're not in charge, and they have to choose between them and the right, and eventually they tilt toward the right. And the reason for that is because the middle class, which was never exactly with the left, turned sharply against the left. And we need to understand the reason for that. So here we have a photo of an upper class neighborhood in Santiago, Chile, and we have these people who are waving a white handkerchief, and that's to symbolize their demand that Allende resign. By 1973, Nixon's goal of making Chile's economy green was working. Copper, as I mentioned, was a very important resource for Chile. Now imagine if you can't sell copper. The US tried to make sure Chilean copper was boycotted. That's going to be a big blow to Chile's economy. So there was that going on, and there was more. I mentioned trucker. Now imagine if all the truckers go on strike. Like imagine truckers going on strike in our society right now. That would make things really difficult. How can our economy function without truck carrying goods from A to B? So there was a trucker strike, and I think that lasted for like a month, roughly speaking, and the CIA supported that. So don't ever say America don't support strike. They do, when they can screw their opponents over. So there was trucker strike, and there was strike and sabotage from other sectors of their country as well. And it all successfully made the economy scream. As you can see here, this is the change in the real wage of Chileans in 1970, between 1970 and 1973, basically during Allende's administration. Allende's program, all those things I mentioned he did previously, actually bore fruits in the early days. In the early days, Chile's industrial growth grew by 12%, and their GDP increased by 8.6%. This also was accompanied by a decrease in inflation from 35% to 22%, and unemployment declined down to 3.8%. So that was this period, and things were going pretty well. It kind of like Allende's program was bearing fruits, and his policy is going to be a success. But then there was the sabotage and the economic warfare implemented by the United States to make the economy scream, and that really had an impact, especially in 1973, where we can see this drastic drop in the real wage of Chilean. And what this means is this also further agitated the middle class. They can blame Allende for this. I mean, they never were too on board with Allende's program. There's this fear of the lower class, the class below you, overtaking you among the middle class. It's a class dynamic, but it's also a racial dynamic. Allende's program is not only to the benefit of the working class, but it's also to the benefit of the other marginalized group in Chile that include indigenous people, like the Machupe. And Latin America, like North America, there's the settler, then there's the indigenous population, and there's racial resentment. In the journalist's description of these middle class counter protests, there was a lot of instability at the time. In 1973, there was pro-Allende protests by the left, and then there was anti-Allende protests by mostly the middle class. And he described how among these middle class people, there was this disdain of what they call the rotos, or the broken ones. And that refers to the working class people who were, poor, darker, so many of them clearly more of an indigenous background, mixed maybe, not pure, not right, There was racial resentment, there was economic resentment, there was a lot of reactions among the middle class, and they become the foot soldier of the right-wing apparatus. Which is ironic, because what will happen later is not going to be to their benefit either. So there was that, there was a lot of instability, and it was coming to a crash. And a coup finally happened. So there was actually one coup that failed, that flopped. This coup was called the Tankritazo. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but it stands for tank coup. So there was a first coup, and the coup was initially discovered. So if you're like a co-conspirator and your plot was discovered, sometimes you just pull a trigger. You don't have time to get more organized. So the generals who wanted to coup in the midst of all the instability I mentioned got their tank battalion, got their probably division, not battalion, but they got their division, and they ran to the presidential palace fired some round, blasted some hole in their prisoner palace and the defense ministry, and demand the president's resignation. At this time, the commander-in-chief of the Chilean army was no longer Rene Snyder, because he's dead. He's in heaven now. Wow. It was a guy called Carlos Prat now. Carlos Prat, he's also a constitutionalist, and so that's good for Allende. Now, he was kind of ballsy, so he got news of the coup, and he went around, he made sure he secured the support of their soldiers, their army, that were constitutionalists, that were willing to support the government. And then he went to where the coup folks are. He went to the presidential palace, the plaza, and he did something that's I thought was quite epic. So he and 3 other officers, carrying only a submachine gun, walk straight to their tanks of the people who were coming in the coup. The people on the tank got their machine gun aiming at Carlos Prat, so it was very dangerous. Carlos Prat went there and he issued an order. He's like, "Soldier, I order you to stand down, report your name, and rejoin the army, rejoin the rest of the army that are not committing a coup." He issued this order, and the soldier on the first tank came down, saluted, obeyed order. Carlos Prat then went around and he did the same thing to the other tanks, and all the other soldiers obeyed command and rejoined him. Finally, there was like one soldier who was not willing to surrender, and then one of the officer accompanying Pratt just went over and disarmed him and arrested him. So yeah, that he resolved it that way, which is pretty epic. Here's a picture of Napoleon. The reason I posted that there is because Napoleon did something similar when he was returning from exile. One of the royalist army that was supposed to confront him went there. Napoleon just came to a friend and was like, "Here I am, I'm your emperor, shoot your emperor if you want." And the soldiers like, "No way, man." And they joined Napoleon. So Pratt's action reminded me of that. That's kind of cool. Now, unfortunately for Allende, and unfortunately for Pratt himself, he was kind of a man that can do both. And by that I don't mean like something positive. I mean, he was able to be very, very brave and impressive in incidents like this. But he can also be quite an idiot. And by that I mean, during one of his commute from his residence to his office, I mentioned there was a lot of instability. On the way there, some people in their upper class neighborhood notice him and they start jeering him, they start booing him, they start harassing him, and he lost his temper. Pratt pulled out his handgun and he shot at a civilian car. Like, he didn't kill anyone, he didn't aim at anyone, but he shot at a civilian car. And that was not really becoming. The people around were like, "What?" And they came around, they jeered him more, they harassed him more, and later on, after the whole incident, he ran to a prisoner palace and he immediately issued his resignation. He screwed up, he know that. And he really did screw up. Like, come on, Carlos, you just don't shoot at civilian. Come on. This was actually before the tank coup, and Allende wisely decided not to accept his resignation, because if he did, well, we won't know how the tank coup will go. But yeah, he did not accept Pratt's resignation, and Carlos Pratt got to stick around until the tank coup happened, and his bravery during the tank coup actually restored his standing a little bit. After the tank coup, however, there was a protest in front of his residence by the families of the military officers that he commanded. So there was a lot of officers, and then there's a family of officers, like their wives and stuff, and they're all protesting in front of his residence. And that convinced him that he no longer had authority to command the army. So he issued his resignation to the president the second time, and this time Allende accepted. A reason for Allende accepting the second resignation was because he thought he could trust his replacement. Carlos Pratt's replacement was Augusto Pinochet. Pinochet led a division of the army that helped to suppress the first coup, and he was the chief of staff to Pratt. So Allende thought, he's loyal, he's good. He was wrong. And this, of course, is going to lead to a tragedy. Let's go back to the timeline. So all that happened in 3 years. That was intense. That was an intense 3 year. But, good thing come to an end, I guess. I mean, it's not really a good thing, but, it's coming to an end, unfortunately. In 1973, Allende met his end. So, let's go back to this chart first. I need to stress something. In the 1973 election, so there was a parliamentary election, these two parties retained their combined majority. They got like 55% of the vote. And that was a problem for them. Now that might sound kind of odd, but the thing is, these guys, the Popular Unity Coalition, increased their vote. I mentioned Allende was elected to a presidency with 36% of the vote, but the Popular Unity Coalition won 44% of the vote. And this was 1973. In 1973, the economy was already screaming. Things were already rough. It was unstable, it was messy. And yet, the Popular Unity Coalition increased their vote to 44%. So first, they increased their popular support, and second, they denied them a two-thirds majority. This is very vital, because in order for Congress to impeach Allende, they need a two-thirds majority. They did not have that. So that was important. That means, legally speaking, they can't get rid of him. They can't just get rid of him through Congress. They can pass a bill and issue a list of reasons why he sucked and denounce him, which they did. They mentioned that Allende was not following the Constitution. He was failing to keep law and order. They said maybe it's better for the military to take over. They just said that. And the court kind of said the same. They denounced Allende for failing to uphold law and order in the country. Allende kind of denounced him too for sabotaging his government and making things messy and stuff. So there was a lot of tension between Congress and Allende. And Allende planned to resolve this impasse through a referendum. This was his plan. I mean, sure, I guess. Maybe it would have worked. Maybe if the popular support for him was enough, the referendum would give him legitimacy, or maybe, he will be defeated, and who knows how that would go. Unfortunately for Allende, though, we will never get to know, because he planned to announce this plan on September 11th, and that was the day Pinochet launched his coup. Pinochet launched his coup in September 11, 1973. So instead of giving his speech on his plan to solve his political impasse, Allende gave his farewell speech where he expressed bitterness but also great hope and faith in Chile to overcome this moment. And then the presidential palace was promptly bombed and he committed suicide. And Pinochet took over. So, it's time to get to know this guy who's in charge now. Look at this douchebag. So first of all, Pinochet was the head of the Chilean army, which is there, I guess. He was also a fascist, also there, but just to make it clear. Dude was incredibly corrupt. By the end of his reign, he had $26 million worth of Chilean money hidden in 120 bank accounts that was spread all around the world. So definitely not in that for the public good. And most interestingly and importantly, he was a neoliberal. This is important. Remember the picture in the very first slide where there was that protester holding a sign saying neoliberalism was born in Chile and that it shall die here? So let's start here. So Pinochet bombed the presidential palace. He took over power. And he promptly started doing things that are very coup-y, Started doing things that are very, as you can expect from a junta. So there was a lot of political repression or political opposition, except for the Christian Democrat were kind of suppressed. To be honest, even the Christian Democrat was suppressed. The Christian Democrat did not expect the military to just take over and then stay there for good. They kind of was thinking, they can work for it and then give back power to civilian control, which aka mean them. Haha, they were kind of naive. They kind of remind me of other similar parties like the Democrats in Thailand, etc. There's a strong, I never thought the Leo prayer would eat my face energy emanating from the Christian Democrat. But yeah, they did that. They did become the legal opposition though, so they opposed the military dictatorship. But legally, so it wasn't too powerful, a little bit toothless, but they became one of the few legal opposition to Pinochet. Leftists were not so lucky, obviously. They were outlawed, they were prosecuted, and suspected leftists were prosecuted, and there was a lot of victims. One of the victims, the most famous victim, is Victor Jara, who was a world-famous musician, songwriter. He was taken to the Chilean stadium, which is like one big stadium in Chile, and reportedly up to 40,000 people were detained there over the course of the junta. Victor Jara was tortured and then killed brutally, and there was many victims like him. In the latest government report published in, I believe, 2011, they reported 40,000 victims, 40,018 to be specific, to which 3,065 of them were either dead or disappeared. Now that's a significant number, but maybe there's more. This is an official report, so need to track people. But this is hard data, so I'm gonna just let you guys know about it. Reports suggested that up to 200,000 Chileans, which was 2% of population back then in 1973, were forced into exile. So this is mostly due to political reason, but there's also economic reason, and that's a lot of people forced away from Chile. There was media censorship, of course. There was just, in general, a lot of oppression and stuff you can expect from the military dictatorship. And those are things you can expect, but there's something different about Pinochet. He had a neoliberal agenda, and by that I mean he invited the Chicago Boys to town. Now, who's the Chicago Boys? We finally got to talk about them. They're not a band, as I mentioned. They're not the replacement for Jara. They're not the junta's answer to Jara. I guess that's a good thing, maybe. Maybe not. No, definitely not. So the Chicago Boys were economists. They were economists from the University of Chicago. And they were the disciples of this dude, Milton Friedman, which you might have heard of. And they believe in something called Neoliberalism, which I'm going to represent with this globe icon, which some people who call themselves neoliberal like to use on Twitter. Now, what the heck is neoliberalism? It's important to know what it means, even though it's thrown around. A lot of people don't really know what it means. And I think the best way to put it simply is that neoliberalism believes society is a tool that should serve the market. And this contrasts with classical liberalism. Classical liberalism, John Adams and folks like that from way back, they also had faith in the market. But their faith was that the market can be a tool to use to better society. The market is an efficient way to allocate resources, and the way it is done through the market is going to benefit people. So John Adams, for example, hated landlord. He hated rent seeking. Compare that to neoliberals. Neoliberals don't necessarily think that. Neoliberals think the market should be served by society, and that's good. That's their efforts. So, for example, Chile. I mentioned Allende implemented free university. that's gone. It becomes something that the market can be involved in. It becomes one avenue for the market to earn profit. So for neoliberals, the government is a tool that can pry open new market for capitalists. So, for example, there used to not be a market in post-secondary education. Now there is. Pension. The pension system used to be public. It was privatized. There you go, another new market. There was healthcare. Chile used to have a universal healthcare system, just like the NHS in the UK or, Canada. They have a decent healthcare system. That's gone. Pinochet dismantled that. It's now a mixed public-private system. And once again, that's an example of how a neoliberal approach is to not only put the market into everything, but also to pry open new market, often in the public sector. Now, for these guys, you can kind of induce that they're not a big fan of democracy. What if the people vote for Allende again? What if the people vote for, maybe not Allende, vote for something that's a little bit more soft left, center left, social democratic? That's not neoliberalism. That's not serving the market, right? And no fear, the Chicago Boys and Milton Friedman have a solution for that. They're going to enshrine neoliberalism into the Constitution. So, for example, I mentioned how Chile's universal healthcare system was dismantled and become a public-private mixed system. That was enshrined into the Constitution. So a lot of these economic policies that you think would be something that's more normal, things we do and normally domestically within the political system, those become constitutional articles. So it would be really hard to change that. No pesky democracy can easily change the mixed public-private healthcare system anymore, for example. And it's not only that, there was a lot of articles that enshrined Pinochet's power. So, for example, there were unelected senators. Pinochet, of course, came with a lot of power and remained the head of the army. There was clause that require a 2/3 supermajority in both houses, so both the lower house and the upper house, which is the center, requiring that much of a majority in order to change the constitution. And since there's unelected senator, that makes it very hard to change the constitution. So that's another way to safeguard all the thing I mentioned, his power and the neoliberalism that they were implementing. So all that made Pinochet firmly in control and entrench neoliberalism. And things are looking rather grim. Things don't look good. So what to do? What should happen? That was 1973 to 1980s. 1980s was when the constitution, the neoliberal constitution that not only grant Pinochet a lot of power, consolidate his influence, but also make sure neoliberal economic policies was imprinted into Chile's constitution, was passed in a sham referendum. That was 1980s. And neoliberal economic policies, they expect it to work well. Okay. The problem for them is that then, in 1982, there was a severe economic crisis. This chart isn't too big, but you can see this was 1982. There was a sharp decline in GDP, the GDP of Chile. Chile's GDP fell by 14%, and their unemployment rate rose to 24%. And a lot of banks were going bankrupt. A lot of sector of the economy is going bankrupt. A lot of them need to be bailed out and nationalized by the government. And if that sounds familiar, that's because that's how neoliberalism works. Even today, remember the 2008 financial crisis? A lot of banks were facing insolvencies, and the US government had to bail them out. Neoliberals have no problem with the state intervening in the market, but when the state intervenes in the market, it has to be to the benefit of the corporation, to the benefit of the market. So instead of nationalizing all these banks were good, you might bail them out and then return them to the private hand and, put things back to normal. So that's kind of what happened here. a lot of banks got bailed out, but they were returned to private hand. A lot of stuff needed state intervention, and they did state intervention, but instead of taking that as a sign that neoliberalism doesn't work as an economic model, they're just gonna put a band-aid on it and keep going because that's to their benefit. That's to the benefit of vested interest in Chile. Now, what the economic crisis did, however, was it made opposition stronger to Pinochet. Despite all the repression Pinochet wrought on Chile, there were public resistance to Pinochet, and it especially intensified after the 1982 economic crisis. I guess when you have less to lose or nothing to lose, economic speaking, you're less afraid of protesting and, risking your life. There were protests, peaceful ones. There were non-peaceful protests. And there were organizations formed to demand justice for those who were disappeared or dead. And there was a lot of energy put toward this opposition work. And this was all going to lead to a crescendo in 1988. So 1988 is going to be a year of another referendum. The 1980 referendum stipulated that Pinochet was able to rule for 8 years. And in the 8th year, there will be a referendum where the regime put forward a candidate for the public to decide whether that dude should continue to be the head of state. Now, the constitution didn't stipulate that that person has to be Pinochet. But Pinochet, he's gonna make sure he's the man, right? So 1988 was going to be a pivotal year to decide whether Chile continued to remain under the neoliberal authoritarian leadership of Pinochet. And with that, I'm going to end this part 1 of the video, which is already too long, I'm sure. This is not the plan at all. I planned for this to be way shorter than it is, but here we are. I can't keep my mouth shut. I can't stop the school creeping. So yeah, if you like that and if you have suggestions, comments, ideas about how I can make this better, please do tell me that. And beside that, look at this logo I designed. Do you like it? Do you think it's a good logo? Do you think it's a bad logo? Let me know too. So yeah, that's my video, part 1, crash course on Chile. I hope you enjoyed that, and yeah, hope you have a good day.